Hi guys, welcome back to the Art of Server. So in today's video, I'm going to help you guys size your bandwidth for your storage subsystem. So if you've ever asked the question, does my hardware have enough bandwidth to allow all my drives to run at its maximum speed? Or maybe I'm upgrading to SAS-3 hard drives, and do I need to upgrade my HBA to a SAS-3 HBA? Those are the type of questions that I'm going to help you answer in this video. So if that's something you're interested in, stick around to the very end of this video. Now, before we get started, do me a favor and smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm so more people can benefit from this video. And if you're someone who likes to build their own servers at home, consider subscribing to this channel because I've got some awesome videos that should help you out in that regard. All right, guys, so let's get into it. All right, so I get this question a lot at my eBay store. People contact me and say, hey, I'm upgrading to SAS-3 hard drives. Should I upgrade to a SAS-3 controller? Or, hey, I'm building a brand new server. I've got 24 drives. What type of HBA do I need? It's going to have enough bandwidth for all my drives to run at their maximum speed. And so I usually answer that question with a kind of a rough estimate, which is, I think, a reasonable estimate. And I call this the 259 rule, okay? And so where does the 259 come from? Well, it comes from the type of storage you have, because that's going to ultimately be the determining factor of how much bandwidth you need. All right, so in front of me here, I've got hard drives, okay? So these are 3.5-inch hard drives. And this one happens to be a SAS-3 hard drive, but the same goes with SAS-2 or SATA 3 hard drives. All right, so one question that I get a lot is that people, maybe they've seen my, what's that, SAS versus SATA hard drive video that I made a little while ago. And they went hunting for SAS drives on eBay. And if you haven't seen that video, go check it out. I'll put a card in the corner for you. But basically, up to a certain size, SAS hard drives are actually a little bit cheaper than SATA drives. And you have the benefit of having enterprise grade reliability. And so I often prefer SAS drives myself. So there are a lot of hard drives that are SAS-3 hard drives. Now you're thinking, hey, SAS-3, that's 12 gigabits per second, isn't that? Hey, that sounds awesome. Well, here's the slightly bad news. The interface protocol, which is SAS-3, may be able to transfer at 12 gigabits per second, but the internal technology, the hard drive technology, simply isn't able to accomplish that. All right. So a good kind of reference performance limit that I use, a number that I use, is 2 gigabits per second. So that's where the 2 comes from in the 259 rule that I'm talking about here. So when I'm thinking about hard drives, I consider 2 gigabits per second roughly the max amount of bandwidth that I can get out of these hard drives. Now, there are newer hard drives that perhaps can exceed that just by a little bit. I don't think by much. I haven't seen anything drastically that much faster. And that's simply a limitation. It's a physical limitation. It's a limitation of physics, basically, because with this technology, you have spinning platters and you have data scattered across those platters. And also the way the data is distributed on those platters affects the performance. And probably the biggest, detriment to performance with hard drives is that you have to move these heads to read the data off those platters. And anytime you have to move the heads, you add latency, and that's going to dramatically decrease your performance, your throughput. And if you don't really understand the relationship between latency and throughput and record size and that kind of stuff, there is a video I made quite a while ago that explains all that and gives you some interesting examples to kind of exercise your brain around those numbers and how they relate to each other. So I'll put a card up to that video as well. So go ahead and check that out if you're not familiar with that. But anyway, with hard drive technologies, they're simply not capable of transferring data more than 2 gigabits per second. And even at that, 2 gigabits per second is really only in ideal situations. That's if you are reading data off the outer edge of the platter where you have the greatest linear velocity. and your data is laid out in such a way your heads don't have to move. They're just kind of laid out sequentially all the way around the cylinder and then on the next cylinder, and so your heads are moving just kind of incrementally as it's reading, each cylinder of the platter, or each track of the platter. That's ideal situation, right? Like under normal use, your data is just not going to be laid out that ideally on every hard drive. And so 2 gigabits per second is, kind of like a good upper limit to use. It's an easy, simple number. Now, keep in mind, and remember, I guess, pay attention to the fact that I'm using gigabits per second instead of gigabytes or megabytes. I like to talk about things in bits because it makes the numbers easier to compare when we're talking about the rest of the storage system. And I know that a lot of benchmarks will tell you numbers in bytes, so you have to do a little conversion there. Basically multiply the bits by 8, or take the bytes and, take the take the bits and divide by 8 to get the bytes. And if you have numbers in bytes, then multiply by 8 to get the bits. Okay. So when I say 2 gigabits per second, that equates to roughly 125 times 2, 250 megabytes per second. So if you go look at some benchmarks of spinning hard drives, you'll notice that they kind of max out somewhere around 250 megabytes per second. Some can go a little bit faster, some are going to be a little bit slower, but that's kind of generally the number I like to use, at least for now, and probably for at least the next couple of years, that's probably a good number to use as a reference kind of performance limit of hard drives. All right, so that's where the 2 comes from in the 259 rule. Now, if you are using SSDs, and this is a SATA SSD, but same goes for a SAS-2 SSD, both of these are rated at 6 gigabit per second on the interface. And it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get full 6 gigabit per second performance out of these SSDs. A lot of the benchmarks land somewhere between 500 to somewhere under 600 megabytes per second in throughput. And so that roughly equates to about 5 gigabits per second. That's where the 5 in the 259 rule comes from. So when I'm talking about SATA SSDs or SAS-2 SSDs, usually the number I like to use is 5 gigabits per second. All right. And finally, for the 9, that goes for these guys. This is a SAS-3 SSD. All right, so these are kind of a generation old now. A lot of servers are moving on to NVMe, but that means you can get these things for fairly cheap on eBay. And so maybe you picked up some SAS-3 SSDs because you want that extra performance. And these do go faster than SAS-2 and SATA SSDs. But I find, and the interfaces are SAS-3, so they are 12 gigabits per second interface. But again, the technology itself usually does not max out the interface. And I find that these max out somewhere about 1 gigabyte per second. And so that translates to roughly about 9 gigabits. All right, so 9 gigabits per second. And so for SAS-3 SSDs, the kind of reference performance number or performance limit number that I like to use is 9 gigabits. All right, so that's where you get the 2, 5, 9. All right, so remember those numbers. Hard drives, 2 gigabits per second. SAS-2 and SATA SSDs is 5 gigabits per second. And for SAS-3 SSDs, it's 9 gigabits per second. And the reason why you need to know that is because to figure out the total bandwidth that you're going to need for your whole setup, you need to know how much bandwidth you can get out of each individual storage device. So let's go through an example here. So here I have a SAS-2 backplane. This is a 24 bay backplane. You can see I have 6 connectors with 4 rows of those connectors. And so that's 24 drives that can be connected to this backplane. And this also happens to be a SAS expander backplane. This comes out of a Supermicro 846 system that I have. So on the back side, you can see that there's a heatsink here, and that's kind of a dead giveaway that this is an expander backplane because there's an expander chip that kind of acts like a proxy basically, or a network switch for all these SAS connectors. So you have to connect an HBA to that SAS expander, and that's done via these ports here. So these are SFF 8087 ports, and there's 3 of them. And you can only connect two of these to, or up to two of them. You can have just one, and that'll work fine. But you can have a maximum of two of these connected to your SAS controller, which could be a RAID controller, it could be an HBA IT mode controller. Either way works. But maximum connections is two. And the reason why there's three, you might be asking, well, why are there three if you can only connect two? Well, that's because you can actually daisy chain downstream to another expander. So on the Supermicro 846 chassis, there's really not much you can do there, but there's another variant of that chassis that has a backplane in the rear. And so you could run two connections to your HBA using two of these ports, and then run the third connection to that other backplane. So basically you can drive both backplanes using just a single controller. So that's kind of what it's for. It's for downstream cascading, I think is the word that they use. Okay, so let's look at this and say, well, all right, let's say I'm setting up a 24 drive server and I'm using hard drives, right? So what was the number for hard drives? 2 gigabits per second. I've got 24 of them. So that means I'm going to need 48 gigabits per second of total bandwidth. All right. And now, again, I just want to caveat this by saying that hard drives, yes, they can in ideal conditions go, about 2 gigabits per second. But honestly, in real world use cases, you're not often going to always see that 2 gigabits per second. There are multiple reasons for that, but which I've already mentioned some. So, point is that, don't be too strict about it. Don't think like, oh, well, if I don't satisfy the 48 gigabits per second, then I'm, doing myself a huge disfavor. That's really not the case. Some people do fine with less bandwidth because, your hard drives just aren't always going to be running at maximum speed anyway. But anyway, let's say that we want to plan for maximum speed, right? So we have 48 gigabits per second of bandwidth we want to satisfy coming out of this backplane, assuming all 24 drives are maxing out at 2 gigabits per second. All right. So we have, these are SAS-2 ports because the expander chip is SAS-2. Now, if you had a SAS-1, then, that's something else. But each of these SFF 8087 ports does 4 SAS lanes, and each of those SAS lanes is a SAS-2 SAS lane. So that means it's 6 gigabits per second. So each of these ports provides 4 times 6, which is 24 gigabits per second of bandwidth, right? So if you connect one cable from this expander backplane to your HBA, say something like this, right? If you have that one cable connected, it's going to work. All 24 drives are going to work, but you're going to be limited to 24 gigabits per second of bandwidth from this backplane to your controller. And that might be fine. For a lot of people, that's plenty of bandwidth. All right, if you think about it, so convert that to bytes, and that's about 3 gigabytes per second. That's a lot of bandwidth. All right. But if you want to go for the maximum use case, say, hey, there are situations where I really want that full 48 gigabits per second out of this backplane to my controller, then you need to connect a second cable. And that will give you another additional 4 SAS lanes at 6 gigabit each. So that's another 24 gigabits for a total of 48 gigabits per second. All right, so you would connect 2 cables from this card to this SAS expander backplane. That will get you the 48 gigabits per second. Now, there are servers that have 12. So one of the very common form factors is a 2U rack mount server with 12 3.5-inch drive bays. Things like the R720XD is one of my favorites. The R510, also one of my favorites from the Westmere generation. Those servers have 12 drive bays. So imagine if this was a 12 drive bay backplane. I don't have one here to show you, so otherwise I would have brought it here, but it would basically be half of this, right? And if you're only doing 2 gigabits per second from each port times 12, that's 24 gigabits per second. And if you are using a SAS-2 connection, then you really only need one cable, right? Some people think like, hey, I've got a lot of hard drives. I need everything. Well, now 4 SAS lanes at 6 gigabit each is 24 gigabits. each hard drive maxing out at 2 gigabits roughly. 12 hard drives is 24 gigabits. So you basically are a good match with just one cable to the expander backplane. You don't really need that second connection. The 12 bay version of this backplane also has these 3 connections. And sometimes people wonder, well, since I have the connection, should I connect it? You could. It doesn't hurt to. It'll cost you an extra cable if you don't already have a cable for it. But that's not a huge expense. But it's really not going to benefit you that much because, again, hard drives max out at roughly 2 gigabits per second. 12 drives at that max ideal condition is only 24 gigabits per second. So one cable connection is usually enough. All right. So other than thinking about the bandwidth between your SAS expander or your backplane to your HBA controller, the other thing you have to consider is getting that data from your HBA controller into your computer, namely into system memory, so that the processor can then process that data or transfer it out the network to if you're streaming your Plex media, stuff like that. So the other consideration is the PCIe connector from this HBA to your system. So how fast can you transfer data across that PCIe connector? A lot of these HBAs, especially the ones that are 8 ports or 8 SAS lanes, is a by 8 PCIe connector. And this generation, this is a SAS 2008. So this is a PCIe 2.0. So we have basically PCIe 2.0 by 8 PCIe connector here. And that means that each SAS lane is about 500 megabytes per second. And we've got 8 of those. So that's 4 gigabytes per second. And again, I like to work with bits. So we're going to multiply that by 8. So that gives us 32 gigabits per second of bandwidth. All right. So now if you're thinking about this, wait a second. Earlier here, we said if we maxed out 2 gigabits per second on each drive, we got 24 drives. Therefore, we need 2 connectors because we want the 24 plus 24 to get the 48 gigabits per second to the HBA. Well, now we're limited here to 32 gigabits. So in reality, you're not really going to be able to achieve that the full 48 gigabits because you're limited by the PCIe connector. All right. Now, in situations like that, you might say, well, what can I do about that? Well, if your motherboard is capable of PCIe 3.0, you've got something newer than this generation of stuff, then you could go to a SAS-2308 HBA like this one, which is a Supermicro AOC S2308. This card is a PCIe 3.0. Now, PCIe 3.0 is 8 gigatransfers per second, but they have a more efficient encoding, so it roughly doubles the bandwidth of PCIe 2.0, but it's not exactly double. It's like a little bit less. If I recall correctly, it's something like 7. So if this was it 8 gigabytes per second, right? And we multiply that. This is 4 gigabytes per second. We multiply that by 8 to get 32 gigabits per second. So this is a kind of double that, but a little bit less. So I think it's, so 32, let's say something under 64, somewhere about like 60 gigabits per second or something like that. So now that definitely has enough PCIe bandwidth to satisfy your 48 gigabits per second coming out of your backplane, right? So if in this setup, if you really want to get that 48 gigabits per second from this backplane to your computer, the rest of your computer, you might need to get a SAS-2308 HBA. But again, if you already have this setup and you're using a SAS-2 HBA, all right, and yes, this is limited to 32 gigabits per second on that PCIe connector. You know what? Don't really sweat it. Like I said, in ideal conditions, you might get 2 gigabits per second out of this drive. But honestly, in a lot of real world use cases, you're not really going to be transferring at that maximum speed very often. All right. So, you're really not going to miss out that much. But if you have some very special use case where you've laid down the data on your platters in some ideal way where you can really sequentially read or write out that data at full 48 gigs per second, gigabits per second on all drives, well then, this would be the ideal card to use because of the PCIe 3.0 bandwidth available to you with this generation of HBA. All right, so that's an example of how you would kind of think about these things. All right, so that's with hard drives. If you're using SSDs, remember, instead of using 2 gigabits, use 5 gigabits. All right, and if you are working with SAS-3, you have a SAS-3 controller and you're using SAS-3 SSDs, okay, not SAS-3 hard drive. This is a SAS-3 hard drive. This is not going to transfer anything close to 12 gigabits per second. This is going to be limited to about 2 gigabits per second and usually less. But if you've got SAS-3 SSDs, then you can take advantage of the actual SAS-3 transfer speeds, but still not really going to hit 12 gigabits per second. I usually see that these things kind of hit about 9 gigabits per second. So those are the numbers you want to use: 2, 5, 9. And use that to calculate how much bandwidth you really need. Then look at your hardware and see how much bandwidth is carried by each of those connections. In the case of SAS-2, that's 6 gigabits per second per SAS lane. Each port has 4 SAS lanes. Now, if you had a SAS-3 backplane, okay, and then that was a SAS-3 expander chip, then usually you would also have SFF 8643 connectors instead of the 8087 here. But each of those SAS lanes can then transmit at 12 gigabits per second, which means that if you needed 48 gigabits of bandwidth, you actually only need one of those cables because 12 times 4 is 48. So using a SAS-3 backplane, even though with hard drives, does give you the benefit of using less cables to meet or match the same amount of bandwidth. But again, a lot of those SAS-3 HBA controllers are PCIe 3.0 by 8. And so you're still limited to the PCIe bandwidth available to you. Consider the path of the data from the drives through your SAS expanders, through your HBA or RAID controllers, and then to your system memory via the PCIe connector, and make sure that everything along the way has enough bandwidth for your needs. All right, so anyway, I hope that helps you guys out in terms of how to think about how to size your bandwidth. And again, 259 rule: 2 gigabits per second for hard drives, 5 gigabits per second for SSDs, SAS-2 or SATA SSDs, and 9 gigabits per second for your SAS-3 SSDs. All right, guys, hopefully that helps you out. If you like this video, make sure to give me that like. And again, if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing if you find this type of information useful. Also, if you'd like to support my channel, go check out my eBay store. I've got the greatest selection of IT mode HBA SAS controllers on eBay. I'll leave a link down in the video description below. Go check that out. If you're building your Unraid or TrueNAS or any ZFS or just software RAID server, go check that out. I've got some awesome ready to go HBAs for you. All right, guys, that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching and have a great day. Bye-bye.